Through the teachings and events of the Passion story, we see and hear the great contradictions that characterize the coming of God's reign. The leaders serve, the empty disciples are able to fill others, proud Peter is revealed in his cowardice, and Jesus, the innocent bringer of life, is arrested, beaten, executed, and buried. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he had learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at the time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people. And here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why, what evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished.
As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." He replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Please be seated. A word before I start my sermon. Some of you may be wondering, why on earth are we saying the Passion story when we're going to be doing it this next week? Well, as it turned out, about, I don't know how many years ago now, the people who had the lectionary realized that there are many people that never show up for the services in midweek and Holy Week. So they go from Palm Sunday to Easter and never really get the dark side of Jesus. And it was at that point that they switched most of the readings to Passion and called, instead of Palm Sunday, calling it Passion Sunday. So I tried to do a little bit of each today because I still enjoy the Palm procession and it's a tradition in this church, but I also wanted to catch some of the people that may not be here during the week. Have you ever heard the story of the guy who went fishing with dynamite? It was ice fishing. He was planning to stun and kill fish by dropping a stick down his hole. Now, he did not kill himself, as you might imagine. He was being careful, or so he thought. So he tried tossing the dynamite in from quite a ways away. He missed the hole, and the stick fell short. He was smart enough to stay away, but unfortunately, his dog was not. His dog thought he was playing fetch and fetched the dynamite. The man yelled and kicked at the dog to get him away. The dog, confused, took refuge under the man's truck, and it was then that the dynamite blew up. So the man lost both his dog and his truck in a single spectacular act. When I was young, I remember I was a risk taker too. I'd ski out in a lake long before it was safe to walk on. With cross-country skis, you can safely ski on ice about a half an inch thick, but you better not take a tumble. I don't ski like that anymore. I'm too wary of what might happen. And the natural consequences of skiing on thin ice and falling through are things, as a 50-plus-year-old, I'd like to avoid now. Natural consequences. We all know what they are, what happens as a natural result of our actions. When we do something bad, often natural consequences discipline us far better than any punishment that we can receive from anything that anyone can do or say. If we stay up too late, we'll pay for it by being exhausted the next day. If we're really acting stupid, like ice fishing with dynamite, what happens after those stupid actions will really punish us. If we drive recklessly, sooner or later we'll get into an accident. We'll have our insurance rates raised, have to spend time without a car, perhaps even have our license suspended. If the accident is really bad, we'll have to deal with the guilt of causing pain and suffering to someone else, and maybe even jail time. As a chaplain, I've counseled with folks who had done something they regret after they're in the hospital. And there are things in this life that can never be undone, at least this side of heaven. It's a wonder that any of us survive this life, physically or emotionally. We are sinful creatures at any age of our lives. We are a whole lot more childish than we'd like to admit. We do selfish things. We do prideful things. We look out for number one, and we ignore those in need. We fight with our loved ones, hurt them terribly. And when we sin, we hurt ourselves too. The natural consequences of our actions each and every day can kill us 100 times. The broken relationships, the lost opportunities. Left to ourselves, without God's help, without others' help, we sin again and again. We dig holes in our lives that are ever deeper. On our own, without help, we spiral downward, going further and further from God as we become more and more sinful. On our own, we can't stop sinning. Putting it bluntly, we, the people on this mortal earth, are addicted to sin. Jesus understood our sad situation. That's why he chose to enter Jerusalem that Palm Sunday so long ago. But unlike us much of the time, Jesus knew what he was doing, even if he was skiing on thin ice. Now, I know they don't have ice back there, really, but the idea holds. When Jesus entered Jerusalem with the people hailing him as their king, he knew that he was signing his own death warrant. The authorities were already out to get him. When he came in on a donkey like a king would, Jesus was challenging the leaders of the Jewish High Council. The next day, Jesus offended the Jewish leaders even more when he cleared the temple of the money changers. It's not a wonder to me that Jesus was crucified on Friday. To me, it's a wonder that he survived as long as he did that week. When Jesus took on the Jewish establishment, he offended some powerful men, men who wanted to stay in power. The death of Jesus was a natural consequence of his actions. But Christ's death was not just a stupid mistake. It meant something to us and to all people. What is the natural consequence of his death? Reconciliation. We all know that his death reconciled God and us. His death brought us back to God when our sin and guilt had torn God and us apart. So how does his death do this? Well, we may remember from confirmation that only Jesus, who was both man and God, could reconcile us. God needed Jesus to bridge the gap between our own sinfulness and God's perfection. And he did just that. But there's another problem. Even if we're told we're okay with God, even after knowing with our heads up here that we're right with God, there's still an emotional separation. When we hurt someone, the most natural thing in the world is to avoid them. We've all been there. We avoid them because we don't want to be reminded of how we've messed up. It works the same way with us and God. In order to be reconciled to God, we have to overcome our emotional tendency to avoid church and prayer after we sin. God can help us to do that too. How many of you have ever seen Mel Gibson's The Passion of Christ? Who could see such a movie and not be moved? To ponder the pain and suffering Jesus endured for us is almost mind-boggling. And to see it in such a graphic form as that movie portrays, almost too much. God loves us enough to do that? If Mel Gibson's new movie did any good, it's not by shocking us. Rather, it is by moving us to awe at the sacrifice Jesus made for us. The movie shows us graphically and reaches into our heart to show us why we don't have to be afraid of God, even when we sin badly. The crucifixion, then, is a precious gift of God, a sign of God's amazing love for us. So how then do we respond to God's gift? When anyone does a person a favor, a person who has character is grateful. Jesus did us and all of humanity the biggest favor in history. The natural consequence of Jesus' death, then, is our gratitude, and we love Christ for what he did for us. So what's the natural consequence of our gratitude? It's changed lives. Mark certainly lived that way. Being a Christian means living our lives in the presence of God. And what a difference that can make in our daily grind. How do we do that? Now, gratitude is an easy way to practice remaining in God's presence. When we remember the actions, the sacrifice of Jesus, each day of Holy Week, we can, each day of this week, be profoundly grateful. His brave entry on Sunday, Monday clearing the temple, Thursday in the garden, Friday on the cross. When we really ponder the events of Holy Week, who can believe that God just wants to punish us? Who can fail to believe that God loves us? If we remember each day what Christ has done, we draw closer to the God who made it possible. And with our hearts filled with gratitude, we no longer have to be burdened by sin and by guilt. It opens a path for God's grace to flow into our lives, the grace that Jesus Christ gives us. The natural consequence of that grace is peace. Peace beyond the touch of any evil that this world can hit us with. I'll bet you remember the story of the man ice fishing with dynamite and me skinning on thin ice long after you forget the sermon. But I hope you remember always what Christ did for us. Let's remember what Christ continues to do for us every day of our lives. And above all, let's remember what Christ will continue to do for us in the years and ages to come, far beyond our lifetimes here, whether we are very wise or very stupid.